Now, there are cases for protection. There are reasons that you put these tariff barriers into place. These cases can include the military self-sufficiency of a country. Military self-sufficiency says, well, what if I specialized in producing MP3 players, and yet the other country specialized in producing food, and then we went to war, and then the other country would stop sending us food, and we would only be able to produce MP3 players. So you would do very badly in a war because you wouldn't have any food. So this military self-sufficiency argument says that in terms of crisis, in terms of a war, you've got to be able to produce enough of the product yourself so that you can survive in those situations. Other types of cases for protection are increased domestic employment. They say if you allow as many imports as you can to come into the industry, you're going to decrease employment in your industry. This is true in the case of the manufacturing sector in South Africa. Manufacturing sector in South Africa is now taking a lot of flack from Chinese, very cheap Chinese products, such as textiles. These products are made at extremely cheap rates from overseas because of the very cheap wage rates in China. They're coming into this country and they're undercutting all our markets, and they're putting our industries out of business. As a result, there's an immediate unemployment in our industries. That unemployment, in the case for free trade, should be taken into other types of industries where we have a comparative advantage, but because of labor immobility, it's very difficult for those laborers to get to other sections of the country where they are needed for labor. So that is the case for increased domestic employment. However, it can be a fallacy because it has happened for one country, but you can't expect it to happen for all countries. Also, there is job creation from an increase in the amount of imports. Those imports need to be sold somewhere, so it can increase the number of shops and the people needed to produce those shops. Transport, increase the amount of people hired in transport for transporting these imported goods, or for shipping, in terms of shipping and bringing them into the ports. So it can increase the amount of jobs. Also, you've got to worry about tariffs in terms of retaliation. If you impose a tariff on a country, they'll impose a tariff on you, so it'll decrease your export. So you have to worry about the retaliation aspect of barriers to international trade. There is also a case for stability. You don't want your country to rely too much on international trade, because then you can specialize to such a great extent that maybe you're only producing one type of good which is available on the world market. Take Saudi Arabia, for example, which are heavily focused on oil production. If the oil price were to decrease by a large amount, their GDP and their income would decrease by a very large amount as well. So they're very highly correlated with the movements in the oil price and the movements in world demand situations. So they aren't diversified in what they produce. They're specialized to a very high extent in terms of one product, and when that product, the demand and the supply changes for that product alone, it will have a very large impact on the entire country. One of the greatest arguments for protection is the infant industry argument. This is saying that if you've got a very small industry which could have great economies of scale, i.e. their costs could decrease when they increase production, but at the moment they can't increase production because their costs are too high, so they can't compete in the world market. They say, why don't you protect those industries by a tariff? So you protect that industry through a tariff so that it can grow within your own country, take advantage of those economies of scale, and then once they've maximized, they've got to maturity, that industry's got to maturity, they can be let out into the world market at that very low price where they've maximized their efficiency and they've minimized their average total cost. So that infant industry argument calls for protection for a small while those industries mature and then get lower cost, better efficiency, and then get rid of the tariffs, and then they can compete on the world market. Another type of argument was the protection from cheap labor. They're saying that because of the cheap labor in other countries, they can produce goods more cheaply, and then those goods will undercut our markets. And we've seen that in the manufacturing and textile industries in South Africa. But those are cases for barriers to international trade. There are good cases for free trade, where you can improve economic growth, improve productivity, and improve output. But there are cases against free trade where it will have short-term negative consequences on your economy.